Thanks for your time. Thanks for the opportunity to preach in front of you, to be with you, with my family, to worship with you, most importantly. For those of you who do not know me, Clark did a great job introducing me. I'd also like to introduce my family, Tier, my wife, and then my three children, Carol, William, and Millie, who are with us today. Fresh off of Christmas, like most of you, or all of you, I should say. So thanks for allowing me to be here. It's good to study the scriptures with you. And I just want to say thank you for all that Harbor does for our ministry. We don't take that lightly. I pray that we don't underappreciate what you all do and the ways that you support our ministry as a church, not just financially, but also in terms of perhaps just labors of love and encouragement to me and to my family, and I really do appreciate that. And several of you individually, we appreciate your support. For those of you who don't know much about RUF is a Christian ministry on campus at Davidson College, and we exist to reach students for Christ and equip them to serve each other, Jesus, and the church. Love to talk to you more about that. Love to talk to you more about Davidson. But I actually would really rather open the scriptures with you and talk to you about that. So would you open your scriptures to the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 26. If you're unfamiliar with the Bible, the Gospel of Matthew is the first book of the Bible. It is right between Malachi and the book of Mark. And as you're turning there, I would love to explain what we're up to and why we're going here on this day of all days. And as I'm turning there, we'll do the same thing. So it's the eve of New Year's Day, and we have a lot in our minds. College football, for a lot of us, is big. There's lots of bowls going on. You've had this incredible time with family, or you've had this horrendous time with family. It's allowed to be both. There was joy, there was celebration, but there was perhaps for some of us tension and sorrow and frustration, and maybe there was a mixture of both this side of heaven. Or maybe you're mourning the passing of Christmas Day, or you're celebrating the seventh day of Christmas and 7 swans a-swimming. If you know that lyric, that's celebrating up to Epiphany, which is coming up with the celebration of the wise men visiting Jesus. And then we're on a Sunday, which for most of us in America is the Sunday before New Year's Day. And New Year's Day is when we make a lot of resolutions of self-improvement. This is where we dig deep and we look at our lives and we reflect. And in, I think, very well-meaning ways, we make year-long self-improvement projects. But I'd like to take a moment before we make these resolutions to look to Jesus and to look to ourselves. And to do that, I want to look at a passage from the Gospel of Matthew this morning. I want us to see Jesus afresh, and I want to do it through looking at the eyes, or through the eyes of Simon Peter. Many of you are familiar with Simon Peter. Jesus' perhaps chief disciple, the person that speaks up at least the most, is the person that follows Jesus in a way that we can all relate to, oftentimes foot in mouth, oftentimes bold and courageous to speak the truth. And this morning we're going to look through Peter's eyes at Jesus so that we can see Jesus more clearly, and so that we can see Peter, through Peter, ourselves even more clearly. And we're going to look at the scene where Jesus is predicting his own betrayal and death, and we're going to look at the way that Peter takes a long look at what loyalty means. And I think this is just a really appropriate way to set our hearts and set our frames of mind again for not just this new year, but perhaps for the rest of our lives. So with all this in mind, we're going to read the passage, Matthew chapter 26, and we're going to look at verses 30 through 35 and 69 through 75. So if you to read along with me, Matthew 26, verses 30 through 35, then we're going to skip a few verses, and 69 through 75. And when they had sung a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. Then Jesus said to them, "You will all fall away because of me this night. For it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock will be scattered. But after I am raised up, I will go before you to Galilee." And Peter answered him, "Though they all fall away because of you, I will never fall away." And Jesus said to him, "Truly I tell you, this very night, before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. And Peter said to him, "Even if I must die with you, I will not deny you." And all of the disciples said the same. Now skipping down to verse 69. Now Peter was sitting outside in the courtyard, and a servant girl came up to him and said, "You were with Jesus the Galilean." But he denied it before them all, saying, "I do not know what you mean." And when he went out to the entrance, another servant girl saw him, and she said to the bystanders, "This man was with Jesus of Nazareth." And again he denied it with an oath, "I do not know the man." And after a while the bystanders came up and said to Peter, "Certainly you too are one of them, for your accent betrays you." Then he began to invoke a curse upon himself and to swear, "I do not know the man." And immediately the rooster crowed. And Peter remembered the saying of Jesus, "Before the rooster crows, you'll deny me 3 times." And he went out and he wept bitterly. Friends, these are the words of God, and they are more precious than gold, even much fine gold. And they're sweeter than honey, even honey straight from the honeycomb. Would you pray with me? Father, I do thank you for the opportunity to sit under your word, to not stand above it, to not stand beside it, but to sit under it. And I pray that you, would help us to sit in that posture, and that you would meet us there. That you meet us there in the many things that have happened in the last week, even, since we last perhaps were in church, or maybe this is the first time in a long time that we've been here. I pray that you'd meet us wherever we are, with our doubts and our securities, with our insecurities and our faithfulness. I pray by your Spirit that you'd use these words and you'd press them upon our hearts, that you'd remind us of who you are, Jesus. We need to see you high and lifted up. We need you to be more believable and beautiful to the eyes of our hearts. Jesus, meet us here through your words, even through my words. And I pray that we would not leave this room the same as how we entered it. That you would change us not just for the new year, but for the rest of our lives. In your Son's name we pray. Amen. So at some point, all of us have experienced rejection or even betrayal. It can be big or it can be small. It can be done to us or it can be done by us. If we're willing to go there, there are times we can all remember when we've been betrayed. But there are also times when we've been the betrayer, even if we didn't realize it at the time and only realized it in retrospect. And so I'm going to actually help us to go to that second, harder place of being the betrayer for a few minutes by telling a story from my life. It was my senior year of college, and I decided that my friend since freshman year had changed too much and he was way too difficult. Among other things, he struggled with a mental disorder and was hard to be around. And so I mentally and emotionally cut him off and even told him I was going to do so and that our relationship didn't make the cut. It didn't meet my highly idealistic definitions of what friendship should be. Only much later did I come to myself and realize how awful and how unfair that move was. How that was me at my worst. I had not only let my friend down, I had let my own idea of who I was down. I'd shattered my idea of who I was. It's here that I and that we enter our story this morning with Peter, with all of these heavy feelings of unfiltered remorse and regret and self-loathing. Certainly these bitter deposits aren't the whole story of who we are. They aren't all of us, even most of the time. But these feelings are a significant piece of who we are. They're a significant piece of all of us. We all have times in our lives, times and places in our lives where we find ourselves unable to live up to even our own standards for what we want to be. There's some deep-seated sense in which we're with Peter in the high priest courtyard, watching ourselves say and do the very opposite of what we expect and what we hope for ourselves. And then there's this cock crow that happens in our lives over and over again. It's the friend's question, or the morning after, or the moment of silence that's deafening. And so what do we do with this bit of reality? What do we do with what we are so quick to dismiss or deny or hide about situations and ourselves? In other words, what do we do when we let God down, when we let another person down, when we let ourselves down again? And that's the question that we're going to circle around this morning. What do we do when we let God, when we let another person, when we let ourselves down again? And this is the burden of why all four gospel accounts tell the story of Peter's denial of Jesus, to help us address this question and to see how Jesus addresses this question about us. How even in Matthew chapter 26 of Matthew's gospel here, we see that he sometimes delicately, sometimes bluntly shows us our full selves and shows forth the full Jesus to us. And we see this in three distinct stages in our passage, if you'll look with me. First, in verses 30 through 35, we see in Peter who we often think we are. So verses 30 through 35, we see in Peter who we often think we are. Second, in verses 69 through 75, we see in Peter who we can sometimes be. Who we can sometimes be. And finally, in verses 32 and 75, we see who Jesus always is. Verses 32 and 75, we see who Jesus always is. So as usual, let's begin with the beginning, and let's move through this passage together, and let's look at verses 30 through 35. And we're going to look first at the way in which Peter shows us how we think about ourselves most of the time. So look with me at verse 30, and let's look at this short statement where we get the place and the time of our situation, of Jesus' prediction of Peter's denial. We see here when they had sung a hymn. This is on the first night of the Passover celebration, after the meal, after Jesus' washing of the feet, and after the very first celebration of the Lord's Supper. And just so we're all on the same page, let me explain what some of those things are. This is sometime in the spring during the Jewish festival that remembers when God rescued ancient Israel from ancient Egypt, what's called the Passover event. And Jesus has explained the Lord's Supper, that is communion, where Jesus' followers drink wine meant to represent his blood and eat bread meant to represent his body, just so we're all on the same page. Still in verse 30, we read Jesus took these disciples, these followers, down from the garage apartment / dining room set that he was in, and he took them down into his favorite green space, into the vicinity of Jerusalem, what's called the Mount of Olives. And then and there, Jesus uses a prophecy of Zechariah from the Old Testament, and he gives his own prophecy through it. Jesus says to all of his followers that they're going to fall away. Verse 31. In the original Greek, this is a much stronger statement. The word for fall away is scandalizo, where we get the word and the TV show Scandal, by the way, for those who watch it. But while the Greek word scandalizo primarily refers to being caused to stumble or being led into sin, you could fairly translate verse 31 this way: you all will desert me. You all will desert me. Notice Peter's response in verse 33. Again, a lot stronger in the original Greek language of the New Testament. Sure, Jesus, they will all desert you. Sure, they'll all desert you, Jesus. But I will never desert you. Do you hear the way that Peter is boasting here? He's comparing himself over and against everybody else. He's saying, I'm not like them. In fact, I don't even really get them, Jesus. I mean, what's their problem? I'm the exception to the rule. I'm exceptional. And we should at least know somewhat what Jesus is talking about here, because exceptionalism is something that is written to the very fabric of American culture from our nation's very beginning. In 1630, on a ship, he's not even in America yet. He's on a ship called the Arbella. John Winthrop tells his fellow colonists that their new colony in Massachusetts is going to be a city upon a hill to be watched and admired by the rest of the watching an existing world. That is, America is going to be a unique and uniquely new nation that's not subject to any of the world historical trends or cycles. It's got a mission to transform the rest of the world for the better. In the 1800s, Horatio Alger takes this idea, this national concept, and he makes it individual in a string of wildly popular best-selling books. He says it this way: by sheer willpower, any American can escape any set of scenarios, usually defined by rags, and make it in this life, usually defined by riches. And of course, along the way, everyone's going to tell you you can't. But yes, you can. Yes, you can. And so in verse 34, when Jesus doubles down and tells Peter, actually, no, you can't, there's something inside of all of us that wants to stand up with Peter, put our arms around him, and shout to the watching world, yes, you can, Peter. When he says, yes, I can. When he says, I will not, no, never deny you, even if it means death. We want to say, you tell him, Peter. Cue the epic movie soundtrack, swelling violins, beating, throbbing drums, right? Here we go. Last Jedi. However, here in the Gospel of Matthew, in our real-life story, Peter's last stand for exceptionalism is met with Jesus' deafening silence. He just doesn't even comment. Then just verses later, just hours later, Peter denies Jesus in the high priest's courtyard. Look, I don't think that the scriptures are against the possibility of social, economic, or political advancement, okay? But I think Peter's almost American kind of exceptionalism and self-belief can lead to this deadly kind of perfectionism. And here's where you and I and Lake Norman as an area enters this story. You see, if we do well in an area, we get superior by comparison. What many people call, what we should call judgmental. I look down on others when I do well. I expect too much from others. I say to myself, I can work. I can keep a great house. I have well-behaved children. I maintain fun and interesting hobbies. Why can't you do that? If we do poorly in any given area, we get inferior. We feel guilty and full of self-despair. I get anxious when I haven't done enough, or I won't be able to live up to my own standards, or live down the criticism that's about to come at me about my job, or about my house, or about my children, or about my hobbies, or my lack thereof. We say to ourselves, I can't. I just don't know how they can do it. The pressure to be the exception to the rule, to be exceptional, has become our ordinary condition. And it is a condition that has become crippling. But verses 69 through 75 also suggest that this kind of exceptionalism is not the full truth about who we are. For those of you still following, we're on point 2, who we can sometimes be. You see, in verses 33 through 35, Peter is arguing with Jesus, God incarnate. Peter's questioning Jesus' all-knowing assessment of him. In effect, Peter's saying two things. Jesus, you don't know me. That's not who I am. And he's saying, I know who I am better than you do, Jesus. Don't you put words in my mouth, Rabbi Doom and Gloom. Again, Jesus is not saying Peter is all bad, that Peter's a denier in every possible way, or even all of the time. But Jesus is saying that we can sometimes forsake and renounce the very things and the very people we treasure the most. Like I did with my friend in college, my senior year. But verses 69 through 75 are a blow-by-blow clinic on the way that Jesus understands Peter, and he understands us better than we understand ourselves. They offer a predictable progression of how we can deny God and how we can fail ourselves. Peter's self-honesty begins with mixed motives and mixed emotions, even as he slinked into the high priest's courtyard. Perhaps he was drowsy from a full meal, from a bad night's sleep or sleepless night, and a red wine. Perhaps he was still woozy from all that had happened in such a short span of time, in just a few short hours. In a few short hours, he had fallen asleep during Jesus' prayer. He had woke up to a violent mob led by the high priest, by the high priest and his friend Judas. He had watched his sword slice through the night air and into a servant's ear. And he ran into a stumbling, panicky run along with the rest of the followers of Jesus. But somehow, Peter had made it back into the courtyard below where Jesus was being worked over by the Jewish powers that be, by the religious council in Jerusalem, the Sanhedrin. To Peter's credit, he was one of the few to follow Jesus this far. To Peter's discredit, he was not bravely by Jesus' side. In the words of Nadia Bolz-Weber, Peter chose instead to anonymously warm himself by a nearby charcoal fire. But you just can't warm feet that have gone that cold. You just can't warm feet that have gone that cold. Then as Jesus confesses the truth to the most powerful religious leaders of that day, Peter denies the truth to the least powerful slaves and bystanders of that day. Verse 69, a servant girl who'd maybe seen Peter with Jesus at the nearby temple the last several days states this. She says, "You were also with Jesus the Galilean." And Peter, afraid of guilt by association with Jesus, gives a very academic answer, right? "I don't know what you mean." Well, that's all problematic. I'm not sure what you're saying. Aren't we all in a way with Jesus in space and time, really? But notice in verse 71, Peter creeps farther into the light, out of the light and into the darkness, farther from the presence of Jesus and nearer to the nearest exit. Verse 71, another servant girl identifies Peter, this time to an audience of folks. This man was with Jesus of Nazareth. And Peter, feeling the pressure intensify, gives an even stronger refusal to associate with Jesus. "I do not know the man." Now there's no chalking things up to some academic misunderstanding. Things are getting personal, even as Peter refuses to get more personal with Jesus. He won't even use Jesus' given name or his title, the Messiah or the Christ. Peter feels forced to take an oath, invoking God the Father against God the Son. Perhaps Peter justifies all of this with anger. His Messiah, his warrior king, would have never gotten himself into such a situation. He would never have surrendered. He would never have submitted. He would never serve anyone like this. Finally, in verse 73, after a long time in the clear, the bystanders come up and they tell Peter, "Certainly you too are one of them, for your accent betrays you." The irony. The more Peter protests his innocence, the more he sounds and is guilty. The more he's proven by his northern careless vowels, the more his Galilean guttural G's and K's convict him. To this proof, Peter again shouts, "I do not know the man." But now he punctuates his denial with another oath, or even a curse, calling down all the evils upon himself if he's lying, which he is, or perhaps even cursing Jesus' very name. And then there's the way that Frederick Buechner describes verses 74 through 75. The old cock waddles, trembling scarlet, as up over the horizon it squawked the rising sun, and the tears running down Peter's face like rain down a rock. The man who thought of himself as the rock wept so bitterly because he could collapse in an instant into a pile of sand. Perhaps Peter ran out of the presence of others and of Jesus because he believed that the curse he uttered upon himself was about to come true. Maybe Peter thought of Jesus' earlier words, "The one who denies me before men, I will deny before the angels." Luke chapter 12, verse 9. Peter despaired that these words were Jesus' last words about him. So what do you do? What do I do when we hit this place? What do you do when you're forced to honestly realize that you let yourself and everyone else down? Do you pivot from self-preservation to self-sufficiency? Making more vows, this time I'm going to, or next time I'm not going to? Do we fortify our public and presentable selves with resolutions of strength and affirmations that begin with Sid always or Sid never? Or do we develop a second self, to slightly own our humanity in certain socially acceptable circles, full of kind of practiced self-deprecating comments, what my friend calls this like getting real self, okay? Saying comments like, "There I go again, little old me," or "doing better than I deserve," or cliche-worn vulnerabilities like, "Oh, I have control issues," or "I struggle with lust," or worse, "I used to get angry and I used to be prideful." Or are you in utter despair when all of this hits, this self-honesty hits? Are you at the doorway of depression, on the brink of heavy-duty anxiety? After all, me without the excuses, me without the qualifiers, feels so unpredictable, feels so unlikable. I think this moment right here is exactly why all four Gospels contain this account. They all record this story of Peter. It's not merely a cautionary tale of what not to do and how not to do it. At the very least, this passage is included in all four Gospels because it tells us about the early church's commitment to the truth. A leader, Peter, is not whitewashed in the least. If anything, he's bluntly called out. But at the most, this story is repeated over and over again because Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John want you and want me to see who Jesus always is. You see, the story of Peter's denial is not primarily about Peter. It's not primarily about you or me. It's primarily about Jesus and how Jesus will never, ever deny me, even if it means his death. As we dig into our third point for my note takers, look with me at verse 32 and how Jesus' promise there comes right on the heels of his predictions that his disciples will betray him. "But after I am raised up, I will go before you to Galilee." After I'm raised up, I will go before you to Galilee. In the following verses 33 through 35, Peter completely ignores the promise. But I wonder if it didn't come to mind also when the rooster crowed in verse 75. In the very saltiness of our bitterest tears, Jesus promises to meet us again, to go ahead of us like a shepherd to his sheep again. This is a promise of Jesus to restore all things back to the way they were, or even better, the way they're supposed to be by his resurrection. Grief to joy, defeat to victory, desertion to renewed allegiance. But verse 75 of our passage also hints at something seen more fully in another gospel that we read earlier. According to Luke chapter 22, verse 61, when the rooster crowed, the Lord Jesus turned and looked at Peter. When the rooster crowed, the Lord Jesus turned and looked at Peter. Jesus was there for the scene of betrayal. He watched the oaths. He watched the curse. He watched the denial go down in real live time. Here might be the most important question of all. How did Jesus look at Peter in that worst of moments? How does Jesus look at us then? Not just in our best moments, not just with our best selves. What is the expression on Jesus' face? There you are, covered in pornographic pixels of shame. You're stuck in that predictable spin cycle of social insecurity. We resent God because our lives are just not working. Or we hide our interest in Him from our friends and family. How is Jesus looking at you then? Right there. Or maybe right now. Everything hinges on this answer to that question. It has this ability to change our lives, not just in 2018, but forevermore. It has the ability to actually make us want to draw nearer to Jesus and not run for the nearest exit. It has the ability to not just help us to think about God in our heads, but to make the penny drop and for us to understand and to believe more deeply in Jesus in our hearts. So does Jesus look disgusted with who you are? Does he look angry at you struggling? Is Jesus looking at you with disappointment or disdain or condemnation? What if in that moment in the courtyard, in the darkness, right next to the nearest exit, what if Jesus looked at Peter with complete and utter love, with forgiveness and understanding? What if Jesus looked at you completely exposed, the public self stripped, the getting real self seen through, all the way down to you as you truly are? And what if the same God turned his face towards Peter and then to the cross, saying in effect, I know you. I know you better than you know yourself. I've always known about days like this for you. And today is the day I will go and die for you. I went and died on a cross for you, Sid, for moments exactly like this. Exactly like that. You see, Jesus' look is the same Greek verb when Jesus first met Simon, looked him over and named him Peter, the rock. Jesus even then knew all there was to know about Simon Peter. He understood who Peter really was. Sometimes a loyal rock, sometimes an unreliable pile of sand. And he counted Peter as his best friend, worthy to die for. And this is so important. God thinks people like Peter, people like us, are worth dying for. He had to die not just for our pride, he also had to die for our self-despair. And Jesus counts people like Peter, he counts people like us as people he actually likes to be around. People he enjoys so very much. He doesn't mind reaching out all the time. He counts us as friends. And it all goes back to Peter's original argument with Jesus in verses 33 through 35. What Jesus thinks about us, what Jesus knows about you, matters much, much more than what we think and know about ourselves. A few years after I graduated from college, I got a call from my friend. I was now married and living outside of Washington, D.C., and the same friend, the friend that I had betrayed my senior year, called me. He'd come back from teaching in a foreign country. He'd rekindled a relationship with a girl, and he was calling to ask me, of all people, to be in his wedding. I didn't invite him to be in my wedding a few years before. I'd had other friends get married. I had other friends that had not asked me to be a groomsman, but this friend was the first to ask me to be in his wedding. You see, he cherished our friendship even when I didn't, and even when I wouldn't. Some of you may think that my friend was sentimental or naive or just some sort of pushover, but I think the shock of it all was that he's like a faded photograph of Jesus' fierce affection for me. When he really gets to know you, Jesus won't run away. Jesus will run you down. When you start to leave the light and when you creep towards the nearest exit again, that's when he's on you. That's when he's all over you, wrestling with who you think you are. People may call Jesus naive or sentimental or a pushover, but he's a friend who will never, ever deny us, even if it means death. His death on a cross. Would you pray with me? Father, help us to sit in that, to believe that it is finished, that what you did on the cross has forever changed our relationship with you, God. I pray that you, through your Spirit, would move in our hearts, help our unbelief. I pray as we get ready to assess 2017 and look forward to 2018, that this truth would be way more important than what we look like, than being more efficient or more productive, having it better together. I pray, Jesus, that you would massage the gospel of your grace into our hearts, that with the heels of your hands, with all tenderness, that you'd remind us of your kindness, and that would help us to turn once again to you. We ask these things in your name, Jesus. Amen.